Corporate Finance Excel Practice Problem. In this presentation, we're going to work a practice problem in Excel related to the calculation of total asset turnover, return on equity, and profit margin. Get ready, it's time to take your chance with Corporate Finance. Here we are in Excel. We have our information on the left-hand side. We're going to put that information into the blue area into our worksheet on the right-hand side. So we're going to have our information up top. It's going to be, we have the sales yearly, so yearly sales, profit margin. So we got the profit margin percent, total asset turnover times per year, 2.7. So total asset turnover. We've got the current liabilities and the long-term liabilities. Those are going to be all the liabilities. So that'll be, the sum of those will be total liabilities, in other words. And then we're going to calculate the return on stockholders' equity. So we're looking for the return on stockholders' equity. So if we think about this, we're going to say, all right, let's start with what's included in the return on stockholders' equity. So we're going to go down and say return on stockholders' equity is generally going to be net income over the stockholders' equity. So we need basically net income and stockholders' equity to be able to calculate that number. So what we have here are the sales, we've got the profit margin, and we've got the total asset turnover. So let's take a look at, we can think about how to calculate the net income using the profit margin. Let's think about the profit margin calculation here. Now we could, if you understand how to take sales and use the profit margin to get to net income, you can do that. But if you just see this ratio, you could say, okay, well, let me break that out into its components and say the profit margin I know is calculated as net income is included in it. And I want to get to net income. That's going to be my unknown here, is going to be the net income. And then we're going to divide that by the sales. And that's going to give us our profit margin. And so we know what the sales are, and we know what the profit margin is. Those two things are given to us, and we can back into the net income. I'm going to go to the Home tab, numbers, percent to format this. I'm going to add a decimal to it. So then you can use your algebra, and now I'd write this down, right? We would say, okay, well now if I write this down algebraically, it would be x divided by 4800000 is going to be equal to 4.5%. And then we could do our algebra and work that out. Let's do that basically over here. You can also just think about this. If you work this a few times, you should be able to see the inverse here. After a while, it's useful relationship to be able to have a pretty good grasp on. That's going to be the sales. So if we know the sales top line of the income statement is going to be the 4,800,000, and we know that the profit margin percent then, profit margin percent is this 4.5%. Let's make that a percent. Home tab, numbers, percent. We're going to add a decimal. And then if we multiply that out, this equals to 4,800,000 times the 4.5. That's going to give us their net income. So net income of the 216. So we can also calculate that over here. Let's do it over here by doing it with the data fill, or the what if analysis, I should say. So I'm going to do the calculation here just to practice the what if analysis. I'm going to say if the formula is going to be net income divided by the sales, and then I'm going to go and say, all right, let's use our what if analysis, go into the data, go into the forecast what if, and I'm going to use the goal seek, and we're going to say, all right, I'd like you to set this cell to what we know it should be, which is going to be the 4.5%. Now I'm going to move the decimal to the right to represent this at 0.045. So the decimal is 0.045, and then we're going to say by changing this cell, and then OK, and then it'll look for that number, and there's going to be our 216, and we can verify that by then doing the calculation, which would be the 216 divided by the sales, this being the 4.5. If we go back to the Home tab, numbers group, make it a percent, add the decimals to it. Let's do some formatting. Let's underline here, font, underline. Let's underline here, Home tab, font, and underline. So now we've got our net income. That's going to be one of the components. Now we need the stockholders' equity is going to be the other component that we're going to need. So we could figure then, we've got the total assets turnover. So that might help us to figure out the total assets. And then they gave us basically the total liabilities. which means we might be able to use that to figure the equity here. So, and again, if you don't really see that far forward, you could say, well, if this is a book problem, and they gave us the 2.7 on the total asset turnover, let me just kind of rework that. Let me rework what that will be, the total asset turnover, and see what the unknown is, and see if I can figure out another unknown, which then I can then use to hopefully calculate what the bottom line answer will be, right? So we're going to say the total asset turnover is going to be typically the sales on a yearly basis divided by the total assets. Now, this is one of those where we have an income statement account and a balance sheet account, so you might see this represented as average total assets on the denominator. So just be aware that's just an estimate. The average total assets, they're trying to look for some number that's going to be representative of the time range, but we're going to use the total assets on the numerator. So the sales then are going to be the 4,008, and the unknown is going to be the total assets. That's what we're going to be looking for here. And that's going to give us the asset turnover. And that's going to be our known number here, which is the 2.7. 2.7, let's add a decimal. Home tab numbers group, add a decimal. Then we can think of our algebra, and I can say, okay, let me write it down in a piece of paper so I can do my algebra on it, which is going to be the 4800000 divided by x, which is the unknown, which is going to be equal to the 2.7. So that's what, then we can solve for x. Now, if we were to do that vertically, and you can start to just kind of memorize this relationship, because again, this is one maybe not as useful as the one up top, or as what you kind of should know after a while, but still really useful. So we can start to memorize this relationship. We can say, well, if I know the sales are this, then I can take I'm going to take the asset turnover, which is going to be the 2.7. Let's make that home tab font group, add a decimal. We can multiply that out then, equals the 4,000,008 times the 2.7. I'm sorry, divide that out, equals the 4,000,008 divided by the 2.7 to give us the total assets. So total assets. So that's a useful relationship to know. We could say, okay, well, if we know the sales and we know the assets turnover, then we can approximate basically the total assets by taking the 4,800 sales divided by the asset turnover of 2.7. And that's because, of course, the relationship here for the asset turnover calculation is sales divided by total assets, a measure of how efficiently we're using our assets. Now let's calculate it over here using our what if analysis again by saying I'm going to delete this. I'm going to do the calculation. I'm going to say this is the sales divided by the unknown that we don't know. We get this kind of error that says basically, hey, you can't divide by 0. We can't do that. Don't you know? That doesn't work. So that's going to mess up our calculation. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put some number here so that we can then not end up with this error, and then we'll change it using this autofill. So I'm going to use the number approximately similar so that we have something similar here. So it's going to be, let's say, 4500000. So that would be 1.1. Now I'm going to change it I'm going to change the yellow item using the what if analysis. So we're going to go to the data tab up top, forecast. We're going to go what if analysis, goal seek. And we're going to say, hey, I'd like you to change Excel. I would like you to change this number to be what we know it should be, which is going to be the 2.7, because that's given over here by changing this yellow cell. Just make that cell whatever it needs to be. So we're going to say OK, and then it kind of figures that out for us. We do have some kind of like rounding differences here, note, because if I do this division, I'm going to say this divided by this is going to, let's add some decimals, home tab numbers, we're going to add some decimals. So that's the 2.7. But when we do the calculation over here, if I was to do it over here, we're going to take the 4,000,008 divided by the 2.7 exactly. And we're going to get something slightly different. And notice if I go to the home tab alignment and add some decimals, it's actually not an even number. So you could actually still result in some rounding differences when you're using when you're using that function, but just note that's kind of the nature of these type of ratio analysis. There's going to be rounding differences, and you got to be aware of what those will look like in Excel. And you can see it here that if you expand this out, you're like, okay, that's still 2.7. What's going on here? But if you expand it all the way out to here, there it is. So it rounded it out to that many digits. And that's why, and so if I did it this way, notice this is purely 2.7. This is really 2.6999 on forever. So what Excel did is trial and error. It did trial and error and said, hey, I'm going to do trial and error rounding out to basically five decimals, which still isn't quite exact, right? So just obviously you're going to want to get familiar with it, with those kind of differences. Again, rounding always going to be a problem when dealing with these kind of things. In practice, of course, you're looking for a measure of relevance in a book problem. Then, of course, you're looking for an answer in a multiple choice question, and you want to make sure you have the rounding properly done with whatever instructions given so that you can find whatever answer they're looking for. Okay, so now we can figure out the total liabilities, and this is simply a calculation of, we're going to assume that they give us the current liabilities and the long-term liabilities, which on the balance sheet are going to be the two components adding up to total liabilities. So that's going to give us the total liabilities, current liabilities, and the long-term liabilities. Summing those up equals the sum of those items. Going to underline this. Let's do some formatting. Underline here, and we'll underline here. I'll get rid of some of these zeros. Okay, so then we can figure the stockholders' equity, because now we know the total assets and we know the total liabilities, and we know that assets equal liabilities plus equity, or in other words, assets minus liabilities equals equity. So now we can say, all right, so I know that we have the assets are going to be equal to so we'll pick up the total assets up top that we have calculated here. So total assets are going to be this item, and then we've got the stockholders' equity, or the liabilities, which we calculated here. So here's going to be the liabilities. And then assets minus liabilities is going to give us that equity. It's going to give us the stockholders' equity, which I'll say stockholders' equity then is going to be here, which will be equal to assets minus liabilities, stockholders' equity, just using the accounting equation, equity being in essence the book value of the company. So now we have what we need to calculate the return on the stockholders' equity. The return on stockholders' equity is that net income divided by stockholders' equity. So we calculated the net income up top. So we'll say net income is going to be this item up top. And then we have the stockholders' equity now that we calculated here. So now we can calculate the return on stockholders' equity. So the return on stockholders' equity then will be equal to the 216 divided by the 1,321,778. Home tab, numbers, making that a percent, adding some decimals to that. Okay, so then the second one says asset base is the same. However, total asset turnover goes up to 3. So to 3, actually it's 3.1, went up to 3.1. What is the return on stockholders' equity? So return on stockholders' equity. So now we're going to recalculate this asset turnover. So let's think about the asset turnover again. And what the formula for that will be. If we had it up top, we have the asset turnover, which is sales, total assets, and then that gives us the asset turnover. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste just the formula, just the values only. So I'm going to paste the values only so that it doesn't try to copy a formula. I just want the actual text is all I'm looking for. Now this time we don't know what the sales are. We have the total assets that we have calculated up top. So we're going to say total assets are going to be equal to, let's pick it up here. And we know that the new turnover is now this 3.1. So let's add a decimal there. Home tab, numbers, we're going to add a decimal there. Then we could solve for the unknown. So if we write that out, it's going to be, all right, we got X divided by the 1777778 is going to be equal to the 3.1. Remember, rounding is going to be involved in this again. You can then do your algebra. If we were to do it in kind of a vertical fashion, then we could say, all right, well then if the total assets are going to be equal to, we know this number, and then we know the turnover, the asset turnover is going to be equal to, I'm going to pick it up over here, the 3.1, then the sales or revenue, top line of the income statement, will be equal to this times this. And remember, this is going to be 3.1 home tab numbers adding a decimal for the 3.1. Let's also figure that using our goal seek over here. So to do that, I'm going to delete this. I'm going to do the calculation, this number divided by this number. Then I'm going to go over here and do our goal seek, go into the data tab, forecast, what if analysis, goal seek. And I'm going to say, all right, I would like you to set this cell to what I know it should be, which is the 3.1 by changing this cell. And then I'm going to say, okay. And so there we have it. And so there, that lines up. That's the other way you can kind of calculate that. You could double check your calculation by saying, all right, does that work? This number divided by this number should be 3.1. Let's go to the home tab, numbers, add a decimal to check it out. Looks like that did indeed work. So then we can do our net income calculation, because remember the bottom line number we're looking for is going to be, and let me just paste it here. It's going to be net income divided by stockholders' equity. So we're looking for net income, stockholders' equity. So let's think about how we can get net income now. So the calculation, we can use the profit margin now. So now we have net income is the unknown. And I'm going to say, okay, that's going to be yellow. That's the unknown for our profit margin. We know the sales now. So I know the sales is this. And that's going to give us our profit margin, which we know to be the this is going to be equal to the profit margin we calculated up top, or we have it right here, this profit margin. So there we have that. I'm going to say, all right, that's going to be home tab numbers. We're going to make that a percent. I'm going to add a decimal to it. The sales number is something that we have now. This is going to be equal to the sales number we calculated up here. We can then write our equation, which is going to be X divided by the 5511111 is equal to, and I'm going to make this into a decimal, 0.045, moving the decimal 2 places to the right, removing the percent sign. So there we have that. If we wrote it down vertically, and we should be able to start to see this kind of vertically, saying, okay, if I know the sales, if I know the sales are the 5511111 and so on and so forth, and I know the profit margin being equal to the 4.5, making that a percent. So I'm going to go home tab numbers percent, add the decimal. Then I know that the net income should be equal to the sales times the profit margin, and that's going to be the net income. So that's going to be the 248 in this case. Let's put some underlines here. I'll put an underline here. Let's put an underline here. Let's put an underline here. One here. One here. All right. And then we can use our goal seek once again to figure it out again over here, just to practice that. I'm going to delete this, do our division. This equals this cell divided by this cell. It's 0, so we're going to go back up top and then do our goal seek, go into the data. It goes to the what if analysis, goal seek. And then I'm going to say, all right, I would like you to set this item to be what we know it should be, which was, I believe it was 4.5%, which is 0.045. I'm going to write it in the form of a decimal. Is going to be by changing this cell. And then we'll say, okay. And it says cell must contain a formula. Hold on a second. Does it contain a formula? Yes. So let's try it one more time. Data, we're going to go what if analysis goal seek. We want you to change this cell to be the 0.045. than by changing this cell, which is part of the formula. Okay, there it goes. So there we have it. So that's another calculation of that 248, the 248 here. You can do it algebraically too. Once you do it whichever way, you can double check it then by taking the 248,000 divided by the sales, the 5,511,111, and then make that into a percent, home tab, numbers group, percent, add a decimal to it. There's the 4.5. Now we can take our return on stockholders' equity, which is going to be the net income, the 248,000 divided by the stockholders' equity that we have, which was the stockholders' equity being this item, 1,321,778, and we can divide that out. This is going to be equal to the 248 divided by the stockholders' equity. Let's make that into a percent, home tab, numbers group, percent, adding 2 decimals to it. Let's put an underline here. We're going to say home tab, font, and underline.